Well, welcome back once again, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at one of those, really memorable presidents. Not very many presidents get a whole era named after them, but this one does. So we're going to be looking at the age of Jackson, as you can see, or the Jacksonian era, or even talking about an entire really concept surrounding American democracy that bears his name, Jacksonian Democracy. So Andrew Jackson is going to be one of these pivotal presidents that comes in and not only do a lot of big momentous things happen under his presidency, it's also that in handling those things, and because of a lot of things going on that really have nothing to do with Jackson that just happen about that time, this just becomes a really pivotal moment in the shaping of American democracy, in the shaping of the presidency. Jackson's presidency is going to result in a major expansion of presidential power, and a much bigger role for the president because he is just one of these larger than life individuals and represents a lot of different changes, and not just changes in the presidency, but changes in just expectations of a president, expectations about who a president could be, where a president could come from, all of those things happening during this age of Jackson. And we're going to be looking at Jackson, both his election, his background, what he means as far as the power of the executive is concerned, what he means as far as the power or the whole American democracy is concerned. And we'll also look at Jackson in this section and the next through the lens of some of the major crises or issues that he deals with as a president, and looking at how he handles those things and how those represent tensions at the time, and also representing Jackson's own ideas about the presidency and about the power of the United States government, the Constitution, all those sorts of things as well. So a phrase we're going to be using a lot during all of this is talking about the expansion of democracy. And we'll hit on that several times here, in that the country is changing. It is growing and expanding, both in a physical sense, with new territory being settled and new states being added and new territories being organized. It is growing in that the population is overall growing, and it is also growing in that democracy itself is growing and expanding and really starting to come of age. It's going to start becoming certainly not inclusive by our standards, but certainly more inclusive than it would have been in the late 18th century or even the earliest of the 19th century. And this is going to have a dramatic effect on politics. That's the name of this subsection: expanding democracy changes politics, because more people are going to be included in the conversation, and that therefore is going to change the tone of the national conversation and change the tone of politics if you're including different people in it and more people having a voice that didn't have a voice before. So let's take a look at what that was like. Let's talk about how politics were expanding prior to or about the time that Jackson is entering the political scene. So moving out of that era of good feelings is what we're trying to get to here. So we've been in that era of good feelings since the end of the War of 1812. And one of the big things that characterized that era of good feelings was the seeming lack of partisanship, the fact that you only had one dominant political party, with the death of the Federalist Party as the result of the War of 1812, that you only had Republicans. Now, I did mention that that's not to say that everybody agreed on everything. It's most certainly not the case, as Republicans could disagree amongst themselves plenty of times. But by the time we get to the mid 1820s, we are going to see a return to that two-party system. So let's take a look at how that happens. So ultimately, we're looking at something that not only becomes a catalyst for Andrew Jackson, but that is also changing the political dynamics, that is recreating that two-party system, and Jackson somehow involved in that. So we're going to start to see the return to that two-party system partially as a result of the election of 1824. Now, in the election of 1824, presidential election, we see a little unusual things happening, mainly in that there were four major candidates, and we know that typically we kind of only see two major candidates. But with the absence of two clear political parties, you had four major candidates. And I'm not going to go into detail about who specifically those were, but they tended to be from four different regions. You had a New Englander candidate, you had a Southerner, a Westerner. They each represented kind of different regions of the country, and therefore represented different regional interests of the country. But the thing about the election of 1824 that we should take away is, because you had four different candidates like that, the vote got split four different ways, and there was no clear winner. That's the ultimate point here is that there was no clear winner in the election of 1824. According to election rules in the United States, it is not about who gets the most votes. You have to have the majority of the electoral college. And in this case, because it got split 4 different ways, nobody had 51%. So, thankfully, the Constitution does provide a procedure for if this were to happen, and that is that it goes to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives gets to decide where those electoral votes need to go, and ultimately they are the ones handed the decision. Well, the House of Representatives election of 1824 ends up there. They immediately throw out the bottom 2 candidates, the ones that were on the bottom as far as the popular vote, and that leaves the top 2. And the top 2 candidates, so who the House of Representatives is actually choosing between, is Andrew Jackson, whom we know from War of 1812 fame, and John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State under Monroe. Now, going into this, Jackson had the lead in the popular vote. So more people had voted for him than anybody else. Again, that's not what matters, but more people had voted for Jackson than anybody else. He was absolutely leading in the popular vote. When the House of Representatives comes up with their decision, they declare Adams to be the winner. So Adams, not Jackson, wins the election of 1824. And if you can imagine, if you're Jackson, you're not too happy because going into this, he had the lead in the popular vote, and yet Congress did not select him as the winner. So he was mad. Furthermore, Jackson doesn't just say, hey, I'm mad about that. He alleges that something kind of more sinister happened. He and his people allege that a corrupt bargain took place. That's what they're going to call this election, is the corrupt bargain of 1824 instead of the election of 1824. And obviously what they are alleging there is that this was a corrupt process and that Adams was not the true winner. More specifically, what they're alleging is this. They are alleging that John Quincy Adams made a deal with the Speaker of the House, who was Henry Clay. And Henry Clay was also one of the candidates in the election itself. So he was one of those bottom, he was either third or fourth. So he tosses out his own name. But being the Speaker of the House, he has a lot of pull and a lot of influence. And the allegation was that Clay had promised to swing the votes in Adams's favor if Adams made him Secretary of State. So that when Adams became president, he would appoint Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. There is absolutely no evidence and no documentation that that is what happened. We do know that Adams won the election, and Henry Clay does become his Secretary of State. So to Jackson's people, that looked suspicious. Again, this is all alleged. There was no evidence at all of wrongdoing. It is a little weird. John Quincy Adams did write in a diary every single day, and the day that this decision was made, he didn't write in his diary. So some people pointed that as a point of suspicion. But again, if you were Jackson or you were one of Jackson's supporters, one of his friends, one of his voters, for the next 4 years, this is the sour taste you've got in your mouth, and calling it the corrupt bargain of 1824, and always feeling like Jackson had been robbed of something, and therefore seeing Adams as corrupt, never going to support him, all of that. So we start to see a rift developing over the next couple of years between those that supported Jackson and are really angry about the outcome of this election and those that supported Adams. Their politics are rather quite similar in a lot of ways, but because of this so-called corrupt bargain, they start to split. So they're all Republicans going into that. Keep that in mind, that into this you had nothing but Republicans. But Jackson's side, in order to separate themselves and distinguish themselves from everybody else, they're going to start calling themselves Democratic Republicans. Utilizing or invoking the memory of the Jeffersonian Republicans and power to the common man and the farmers and rural American interests and all those kind of things. And that's always going to be the kind of interest that Jackson supports. He literally sees himself as the heir of Jefferson and is very much always invoking Jefferson's memory. So they call themselves Democratic Republicans to say we are, this kind of Republicans. Adams's side start calling themselves National Republicans. And Adams is very much a nationalist, as we know, and will continue to be a nationalist throughout his presidency, favoring very powerful national or very powerful federal government. So this becomes the Adams side of things and the Adams wing and the pro-nationalism wing of the Republican Party. Well, Democratic Republicans and National Republicans won. That's kind of similar sounding, and they're also both mouthfuls to say. So eventually they start shortening their names, and the Democratic Republicans are going to soon start calling themselves Democrats, and National Republicans will soon take on the name Whigs. And so those are going to be our next two political parties for the next good bit, and that's going to be Democrats and Whigs. And while, again, 100,000 things have changed and it's not exactly the same, this is the precursor of the modern day Democratic Party. So one of the political parties has been Democrats ever since somewhere around 1824 when the Jacksonian Democrats formed. Again, that doesn't mean it's the exact same thing, but it is like the grandfather of the modern day Democratic Party. So Democrats and Whigs for the next little bit here. Those will be the two parties we'll be contending with. So now let's take a look at what happens 4 years later when it's time for a rematch, essentially. So 4 years later, fast forwarding to 1828, and we are going to see a rematch between Jackson and Adams once again. So Adams running again as the incumbent, as the Whig, and Jackson as the Democrat. Now, the thing about Adams and Jackson is that their politics were actually quite similar on a lot of things. They really didn't disagree too much on a lot of the issues. And so in the election of 1828, because they really didn't have a whole lot of policy differences, they instead focused on more personal differences, differences of personality, differences of character, differences of the individual rather than the politics, which to us in the 21st century, that's not new. We are used to that. We almost hear talk about personality and character as much as we do politics. But in these days, that simply just wasn't done. It made this a very interesting election. So the election of 1828 can be characterized not only as a rematch between Jackson and Adams, but as a mudslinging election. This was where a lot of ugly mudslinging was happening. And mudslinging is, again, going to be something that's not at all unfamiliar to us, but in 1828 it was highly unusual. And that is making personal attacks on each other. The candidates were making personal attacks, attacking each other's background, attacking each other's personality, their character, their family, their friendships, spending more time on that and throwing dirt at each other and spreading rumors and exaggerating things and, painting each other in a bad light was far more common than them saying, well, he's going to do this or he's going to do this as far as policy. Because again, they were kind of the same. So they revert to each other's personalities. So a little bit what they say. Jackson accuses Adams of being elitist, of being out of touch, and Adams, he doesn't have the background of most people. His father was president. He's been to Europe. He was well educated. He's New Englander. He came from not extreme wealth, but more wealth than most Americans had. And so Jackson paints him as wasteful, paints him as it's too overly nationalistic, paints him as being out of touch with the American people, not really knowing what the average American person dealt with or what their life was like. And that would have been, Adams would have been an easy target for that. Most people's fathers were not president and, didn't grow up into politics the way that Adams did. Jackson, however, is accused of far more nasty things. Jackson is called a barbarian. Jackson is called, basically just a sort of a backwoods, completely unfit for office wild man, And the thing about Jackson that made him an easy target there was Jackson was from a much more rugged upbringing than any president or person pursuing the office of president had been before. Jackson is the first one that was not from New England or from Virginia, that did not come from inherited wealth, that was not brought up in a reasonably wealthy family. He does not have formal education. Things that, nowadays we might look at as great virtues, which Jackson does, paint those things as great virtues and says, I'm just like the rest of you. Those were used against him in the election to say that he was just completely unfit, uneducated, just unsuitable for the noble high office of president. He is also accused of being an adulterer, which again, in our time, that's not unusual for them to dig into their past relationships and make all kind of accusations. But in this day, that just wasn't done. And so they called Jackson an adulterer because they dig up that he was not, or rather that his wife, whom Jackson loved very, very much, that she was not legally divorced from her first husband when she married Jackson. So they argued that Jackson is committing adultery, that he's a bigamist, living with and being married to a woman who is already married. And that was the one that Jackson took the most offense to. And his wife actually died right after the election, and he always blamed it on the people that said those things about her, that it was damaging to her health. Nevertheless, despite all these accusations, Jackson wins the election, and he wins the election partially because the election of 1828 also includes more voters than have ever voted before. There are more people participating in this election than have ever done so before because of the changes in voting requirements. Most states were dropping property requirements to vote by this point. Most of them had done so. And so you have a lot of people voting in 1828 that are non property owners that have never voted before. And those people are far more likely to support somebody like Jackson. And they found common ground with Jackson because of that humble upbringing. Because and keep in mind, by the time runs for president, he's a very wealthy man, but he did not start out that way. And he didn't come from a prestigious family. He was orphaned by the time he was a teenager. He really was a self-made person. And you can imagine that some of these poorer Americans, more middle to lower class folks, those that were just getting the right to vote, found resonance with that, and therefore are going to overwhelmingly support Jackson, and that gives him the support that he needs. Now, these changes that we've just articulated, this is part of this overall bigger, far reaching change that was really taking place in America at the time. And Jackson becomes the face of it. Jackson represents it, although he himself may not have done all those things. But again, Jackson, it really becomes bigger than himself. Jacksonian democracy is the term used to describe how democracy was changing in this time. Around the 1820s to the 1830s is what we're talking about. Jacksonian democracy refers to an expansion of democracy. So when you hear that phrase, Jacksonian democracy, think expansion of democracy. That democracy was expanding. It was becoming somewhat more inclusive. It was becoming more of a common man democracy, as Jackson would put it. This is where we see this phrase, the age of the common man, the day of the common man, which we kind of talked about that with Jefferson a little bit, but it's becoming even more real under Jackson. And that's represented in a lot of different ways. So all these things that we're about to list here are ways that personify elements of Jacksonian democracy, ways that democracy was changing to become more inclusive and to become more open. Now, granted, keep in mind, this is certainly nowhere near the kind of openness and democratic society that we see today, but it's a step in that direction. You see, it's still a far cry from what we saw in the Jefferson years and so forth, despite all of Jefferson's talk about the common man. So one way that we're seeing this Jacksonian democracy element, the democracy is opening up, is the idea of the common man president. Jackson himself personifies this idea of an expansion of democracy because he is the first president that could really tout this whole common man background. As I was saying a moment ago, he's the first one that is from what was a Western state at the time. He's from Tennessee, which was kind of the frontier. He is, doesn't come from a wealthy family. His parents were not rich. He was orphaned by the time he was a teenager. He did not have formal education. Those were things that, even as much as Jefferson might have talked about loving the small farmer, he wouldn't have thought that person needed to become president. He would not have thought that person needed to be, a senator or something. There was a difference in that. And here we have the idea that someone like Jackson could even become president was new, that person shouldn't just be empowered with voting rights, but that someone like that could ascend to the highest office. That was completely new. And that is part of this whole Jacksonian democracy idea. And not just as president, really as anything. We also have the expanded voting rights that I was talking about a moment ago. We have far more people voting by this time than have ever voted before, in that most states have opened up voting rights to non-property owners. Now, it still would have been men. It still would have been white men. But by opening it up to those that did not necessarily own property, you're still adding a significant number of people to the electorate that would have been excluded even under Jefferson's time. Remember, to Jefferson, land ownership was important. And here we see more people that are not landowners. And once again, that's going to be more leaning toward Jackson's side. We also have changes in democracy. This one is more closely associated with Jackson himself, and that is the heavy use of something called the spoil system. When you think of the spoil system, think of Andrew Jackson. He does not invent it, and it absolutely continues on well after him, but he is the first one to really use this in large numbers, or in mass, really. The spoil system is the system of appointing appointing your supporters, your political friends, your political allies appointing them to government jobs, giving them government jobs. So giving them appointments in the cabinet, in all other kinds of federal agencies, whether it's a secretary of this or a leader of some commission, down to someone who might be a clerk or something, but putting in the people that you like, putting in your friends, rewarding them. That's the system of reward, that you're going to reward people for their loyalty, reward people for their service, reward people for their support by giving them government jobs. Now, obviously, there's a lot about this that can become quite corrupt, and later you will look at serious accusations against the spoils system and later attempts to reform it. But under Jackson's time, he actually argued that this was much more democratic, that this was a better way to do things and a much more democratic way to do things because it meant more turnover. It meant more people had the chance to serve in the government because in the earlier days, a lot of those jobs were held by the same people, not so much cabinet posts, but some of the other ones were held by the same people, sometimes for 10, 20 years. And Jackson argued that you needed more change, that in order for there to be a truly democratic society, you needed to give more people the opportunity to be in government service. And Jackson argues that this means the common man gets more of a chance because someone like him is more likely to appoint someone who comes from a more humble beginning, who fits with more of that common man background and all of that. So he argued that this meant more variety, it meant more ideas, it meant more people got a chance to participate in the government and actually be a part of it as opposed to just watching from afar. There are also some changes in the election process, or rather changes in the nomination process, that are also reflective or that become a part of this whole Jacksonian democracy ideal. Namely, we're seeing political parties change the way that they nominate candidates for office, and that they are beginning to use what are called nominating conventions. We still see those today. But what that boils down to is that political parties were starting to include more people in the nomination process, in choosing who they're going to run as their presidential candidate, who are they going to run as their senatorial candidate or their gubernatorial candidate, all those sorts of things. Who are they going to put on the ballot? They were including more people in that process. Prior to this time, those decisions were usually made by just a handful of individuals, just a few party bigwigs, behind closed doors in the smoke-filled room. But by using a nominating convention, you were now opening that process up from maybe 5 or 10 people to perhaps hundreds of people were going to help make that decision. So it's just making it more inclusive and more a reflection of what the people want, more a reflection of the people's voice. And that is all what Jacksonian democracy is about, is including the people. So think of Jacksonian democracy as rather similar to Jeffersonian democracy, same rhetoric, but more actual deliverance on including more people. And folks that wouldn't have even been included in the whole Jeffersonian democracy idea are being included when it comes to Jacksonian democracy. So, in looking at Jackson's presidency, I like to look at it through the three kind of major crises that Jackson is going to preside over in his presidency. And we'll look at how he handles all of those things. But I also want us to take a time to pay attention to the the things that were really in conflict here more than just people, but how each of these things were also crises or struggles of power between the federal government or the national government and state governments. And we're going to see how Jackson responds to each of those things. Now, one of the crises, I guess you could say, if you can really call it a crisis, but more of an issue, a long, brewing, ongoing one that Jackson is probably remembered most for, and not necessarily in a positive way, is the treatment of Native Americans, and specifically the removal of Native Americans under his tenure, or actually how it's sort of begun under his presidency. So let's first clarify which Native Americans we're talking about and where. So we're talking about Native Americans in what is today the southeastern part of the United States, actually our part of the United States. It does specifically refer to most of Alabama. You're also talking about Georgia, the Carolinas, Florida, Mississippi, those areas. So the current southeastern portion of the United States. And the tribes that were living in those areas, the Native American tribes that we're talking about, were often called or referred to by a lot of Americans during this time as the 5 civilized tribes. And you probably recognize some of these names because they're familiar to us, because they're the ones that were in this area, such as Creeks. If you're talking about Alabama, those Alabama Creeks that inhabited most parts of Alabama. You have Choctaws, Chickasaws, Seminoles, and I'm forgetting the fifth one off the top of my head, but Cherokee, I'm sorry. Cherokee is a big one. So those are the five so-called civilized tribes. And the reason they were referred to as civilized tribes, just so we understand a little bit more about them, obviously that's kind of a condescending word to them, but it's the result of the fact that back in the 1790s, there had been programs initiated by the Washington administration to kind of force or encourage, force is probably a better word, Native Americans in this area to adopt basically Anglo-European American white culture, to basically shed a lot of their tribal culture, shed their tribal identity, and to essentially Americanize them, European or Americanize them. And so there have been programs to encourage them to farm, to modernize, do different things. And for the most part, a lot of that had kind of worked, I guess you could say, or at least that Native Americans in these areas, a lot of the Creeks and Cherokee and so forth, had adapted and had assimilated. A lot of them are English speaking. Most of them are farmers. They're landowners. Some of them have big plantations, a lot like white Americans. Many of them are slave owners. Many of them have adopted Christianity. They do still hold on to a lot of their tribal identity, but many of them do, in addition to a Native American name, also have a very American or English or at least European sounding name as well. Students are often confused when they hear about Native Americans named John and William and things like that, but a lot of them had, to a high degree, adopted a lot of not traditional Native American ways of life. So that's why they were looked at as the so-called civilized tribes, because these were some that, like I said, were generally peaceful, English speaking, so forth and so on. You get the point. And for a while, since the 1790s, that had worked, and that had been a pretty good balance, a pretty good relationship. And there were many treaties that the United States had with these Native American nations, like the Creeks, like the Cherokee, that gave them rights to their land, rights to live, to hunt, to govern essentially the land that was theirs. For example, for Creeks in Alabama, the area where we are right now was for a long time Creek land, and their way of life, their rules basically applied to that, not necessarily the law of the state of Alabama. But as we are moving into the 1830s, 1820s, really 1830s, and this area of the Southeast, including Alabama, we can just use our neck of the woods as an example because it's what we know, was becoming far more desirable to white American settlers. This was land that people maybe 20, 30 years before were not all that interested in, but now they are, because we're starting to see the expansion of cotton production. This was very, very fertile land for growing cotton. And so that was creating a problem, a dilemma. So let's look at what this so-called Indian problem was under the Jackson era. Now, we have sort of the very, very superficial surface issue that we know has been the problem, as it were, for a long time, but then we're going to look a little bit deeper. So the surface superficial problem that's no different than the issue with Native Americans that has been around since the beginnings of European colonization is that you have land, in this case in the Southeast, in the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, that Native Americans claim that has been their ancestral home for generations, for centuries in some cases. And they're wanting to hang on to that land and their culture. And that land is also being desired by white Americans. And so they're trying to find a way to get them off of that land. The problem was there are already existing treaties with the United States government that basically says this land does belong to them and their rules apply in that land. So we have this conflict not only of people, but also a conflict of, treaties and state conflict between the federal government and the states, essentially, because you have federal law treaties that say certain things, but the states like Alabama, Georgia, and others are starting to refuse to abide by those treaties. So what's beginning to happen is that states like Georgia, states like Alabama, states like Mississippi are beginning to extend their laws over these Native American groups and saying that our laws now apply to you. And basically they're just starting to ignore and defy and violate those treaties with Native Americans. And they are allowing settlers to encroach upon their lands, allowing them to settle there, allowing them to interfere with Native American ways of life there, and conflicts then are occurring. What they're trying to do, since they can't really throw the treaty in the trash, but they can't ignore it. And what they're also doing is by extending their laws over Native Americans in violation of those treaties, by the ways, and extending laws that are very hostile to Native Americans, trying to create a situation in which they will want to leave, in which it won't be conducive for them to stay. So we have a conflict with state governments trying to do that, settlers encroaching upon their land. Their state governments are allowing that, not trying to enforce the treaties. And so many of these Native American groups are saying, wait a second, this is our land. We have treaties with the United States government that says that it is ours, that says that you cannot do A, B, and C. And they're demanding some kind of action. So that's where Jackson comes in and the federal government comes in. Does Jackson enforce those federal treaties and tell states like Alabama and Georgia that you have to back off, you have to give these people their land and their way of life? Or does he side with those states? Now, it should probably be no surprise to you that Jackson is not a lover of Native Americans and already had a reputation as a Native American fighter. All of that stuff right before, or actually during the War of 1812, wrapped up in the War of 1812 were Native American wars that Jackson was fighting. So while he likes to consider himself a protector of Native Americans and that he sees Native Americans as like our little brothers that we have to take care of, he did not think they were equal to the white man, and did not think that they deserved fair treatment, and definitely saw the economic potential of land like in Georgia and so forth. And he's going to side with those states. So Jackson's answer to all of this is, I'm just the president. I can't force Alabama and Georgia to give you all these things. I can't force Alabama and Georgia to obey these federal treaties. I'm just the president. They are sovereign states. I cannot help you. So he refuses to enforce those treaties and instead proposes, or has Congress propose as a compromise, a law that he sees as somewhere in the middle. Now, before I get ahead of myself, let me mention then what these Native American groups are going to do, which is kind of interesting. So in response to the fact that states like Alabama and Georgia and Florida and Mississippi and others are refusing to acknowledge federal treaties, and they are allowing a settlement onto their lands, they are extending their laws, they are creating a situation that is difficult for Native Americans and that is in violation of those treaties. I have two court cases, two lawsuits have been basically that are filed, and these are essentially the same case. There's a technical difference between them, but it is basically the same question with the same answer. Cherokee versus Georgia, and then Worcester versus Georgia. Basically, both of these are the Cherokee Nation of Georgia fighting back in the legal system. They are suing. They go to court over this, which is kind of interesting in that, the Cherokee, like I mentioned, a lot of these tribes were so-called civilized. So their, answer to, oh, you want us to assimilate and be like you? Okay. So they hire a lawyer and take it to court. The interesting thing is that Cherokee versus Georgia is technically thrown out on a technicality, but Worcester versus Georgia is essentially the same case, where the Cherokee are basically saying, this is federal law, this is what the treaty says, you have to enforce it. And the states like Georgia in this case are wrong to try to encroach upon our lands and take away our rights. And essentially the court ruled in their favor. The court did rule that they were essentially, a somewhat sovereign nation, and that treaty had to be upheld. And just if you're interested, Cherokee versus Georgia, I mentioned that it was thrown out on a technicality. The technicality was that as Cherokee, as citizens and members of the Cherokee Nation, they were not citizens of the United States and therefore couldn't sue in American courts, which that sounds like it's kind of dumping on them, but in a way it was really a victory for them, because that's essentially what the Cherokee were arguing, was saying we're not citizens of the United States, and therefore, Georgia's laws don't apply to us because we're not Georgia citizens. We're citizens of the Cherokee Nation. But essentially you have the courts technically upholding Native American rights and upholding these treaties and saying that states like Georgia and so forth were wrong in what they were doing and what it was illegal. But Jackson says, I'm sorry, I can't enforce that. There's a famous line that he says, well, Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let's watch him enforce it, implying that he as the executive was the one who got to decide if and how it were to get enforced. It's not confirmed whether Jackson actually said that, but Jackson does decide that he is not going to enforce these rulings as the executive and instead proposes an alternative. Again, he's taking the position, at least publicly, that he does want what is best for everybody. He wants what's best for Native Americans, but he cannot stop these southern states from doing what they're doing. So the Indian Removal Act is proposed as sort of the compromise. So this is proposed as the solution to this problem that is supposedly going to make everyone happy. Now, the Indian Removal Act is a little bit misunderstood sometimes because people tend to oversimplify it and say that this just says Native Americans have to leave, that it just removes them. That is going to be the result, and that most certainly was the purpose. But that's not exactly what the law says. The law is a little bit more tactful than that. What the Indian Removal Act does is it essentially offers Native Americans in this area a land exchange. It basically means we're going to throw out, if you agree to this, we're going to throw out the old treaties. We're going to write new ones. We're going to make new treaties with you that are going to give you a land exchange. You give us your land in Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina, wherever the case may be. You hand that over to the United States, and we will then relocate you west of the Mississippi. We will give you new land. We will pay for all your transportation costs. We will pay for all of the logistics of it. We will make sure you get out to these lands west of the Mississippi safely, and that land will be yours forever and always. And we'll even support you for a full year. For 12 months after that, we will give you funds and supplies and the tools that you need to start farming and build your houses and all those kind of a thing. So this was proposed as the alternative. And Jackson proposes this as the ultimate solution because you're going to get land and, we're going to pay for it. And it's all at the expense of the federal government. And then it's good for these states and it's good for the United States as a whole because it means that these lands can now be used properly. They can be farmed and be productive, implying that Native Americans weren't being productive with the land. And this is all going to be just great for everyone. So this is what he proposes as the only option. So over the next couple of years, Native American tribes will one at a time eventually negotiate new treaties with the United States government. So most of them do end up taking this deal. But I do want to point out that when they take this deal, it is not because they necessarily think it is a good deal. For most of them, it was really their only choice because if they stay, then life is going to be increasingly hard. If they stay, that they're going to continue to be harassed. They're going to continue to have their lands taken. They're going to continue to be subject to discriminatory laws against them that are eventually, going to be taking away their culture. So most of them saw this not as the best option, but as the only way to preserve their way of life at all. And also, when a lot of these treaties were renegotiated and a lot of these land exchanges took place, many of them were fraudulent, including the case of the Cherokee, which we'll get to in just a second. So while this was not accepted by Native American tribes as the best option, it does eventually result in that. So over the next couple of years, old treaties are torn up, new ones are written, and that does eventually result in the removal of nearly all Native American tribes and Native American people from the southeastern portion of the United States. So pretty much all of the Creek Nation, the Cherokee Nation, Choctaw Nation, all of those will end up being relocated west of the Mississippi into what is today Oklahoma and Arkansas and a few other places, which, by the way, we must keep in mind that that land was not unoccupied, that there were Native Americans already living there, and so they are put into conflict with them and face a great deal of difficulties. Now, this, of course, brings up the infamous instance of the Trail of Tears that I think a lot of you are probably already thinking of, particularly as you see this image here. And there were actually multiple trails of tears. All of the relocations really could be referred to that. But the Trail of Tears, the one everybody's probably thinking of, specifically refers to the Cherokee. The Cherokee, if you remember, were the ones we talked about earlier that had actually filed lawsuits and technically won lawsuits in court that upheld their rights to their land in what was mostly Georgia and parts of the Carolinas. But nevertheless, those were not enforced and new treaties were written. The Cherokee eventually refused even still to leave their land. They claimed that the treaty that was made was fraudulent, that the people that had made that agreement did not have the authority to do so. And that was quite common. Some of that, kind of egregious, and some of that because just Americans didn't always understand that calling somebody a chief or something like that, or even a leader, that didn't necessarily give them the right to sign away the whole tribe's land. And so that was the argument of the Cherokee, is like, just because you sign an agreement with this one person doesn't mean that the rest of us have given up anything. So they refused to leave. And so when they refused to leave, the United States government forced them to leave. They went into Georgia, rounded up people at gunpoint, sent in marshals to escort them to the relocation places. So they rounded them up and put them into detention centers for a while, and then eventually forced their relocation out west. And that, of course, is the infamous Trail of Tears that I'm sure you've heard of. Again, there are actually lots of trails of tears. Any of these relocations could really be looked at that way, but the one that's thought of the most is the Cherokee, because it was very, very forceful. It really literally rounded up and herded to Oklahoma at gunpoint. And of course, this connotation of tears, of it being sad, not just because they were leaving, but because this journey was incredibly difficult. It is thousands of miles that many people are walking on foot. There was disease, there was a lack of food. Many people died on the Trail of Tears and don't even make it out to Oklahoma. But this does eventually result, as I said, in the relocation of pretty much all Native American tribes in that general region. And in this case, if we look at it as a matter of federal government versus state government, Jackson sided with the states there and said that the federal government didn't have the authority to force these states to do certain things, and offered up Native American removal as another option. So that's, we think of Jackson as being a great hero, but certainly to Native Americans, he probably wasn't. And that probably brings up more negative connotations and painful memories than anything else. So next time we will look at some of the other major crises of Jackson's presidency. We'll be looking at his issues with the National Bank, and also digging up that old doctrine of nullification that we talked about a while back.